Welcome to the Art of Procurement, the official podcast of the Catalyst Co community. And our purpose is to enhance the impact of procurement by elevating the discussion one conversation at a time. Here at Art of Procurement, Catalysts come together every single week to share their challenges, ideas, successes, and perspectives on the business of procurement. Hi there and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. I'm your host, Philip Eidson. And firstly, I want to thank you all for the responses to last week's pod. They're really helpful as we put the finishing touches on our 2019 planning here at Catalysco and at Art of Procurement. So we have 3 weeks left of 2018, at least from the podcast perspective. I'll be having the last podcast of the year. It's going to be December the 17th. So I just wanted to give you a quick heads up that that's kind of how the last few weeks of the year will go. We'll have an interview for the next 3 shows and then wrap up on the 17th. Before I actually tell you about this week's guest, I do want to let you know that we have a special Cyber Monday offer for the team edition of our micro-learning program, the Catalysco platform. So the team version is for small and medium-sized procurement organizations who value the ongoing learning and development, but that want a structured, action-oriented approach, which is built around some key procurement capabilities and themes. And it's a lot around the softer skills of procurement and actually elevating the technical skills that we already have. So for teams of under 15 people, the investment is $1,000 per person, and then $900 per year per person for any additional team member above those 15. That's a 16 to a 25% reduction on our regular pricing. That's for Cyber Monday. And to get that, you just need to confirm an expression of interest by December the 1st. So for more information about the team version of the Catalysco platform and to express your interest in our Cyber Monday offer, just head on over to artofprocurement.com/team. That's artofprocurement.com/team. Okay, so on to today's show. I recorded today's episode live at ProcureCon Indirect West, which was back in late September, before all the craziness of my recent move. And my guest is Edmund Zagorin. Edmund is the founder and CEO of BidOps, and I hope he won't mind me saying this, but a bit of a technology geek when it comes to procurement. So our conversation today focuses on the application of emerging technology to the sourcing process, particularly complex sourcing events, and then the subsequent negotiation process. Of particular interest to me was Edmund's quest to automate the negotiations process. I dug into the what, the why, and the how as I explored if negotiations can be completely automated or if automation in the negotiation process is actually more of a help to the human to ultimately seal the deal. So let's go straight into the conversation as I ask Edmund if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
So I think it was actually a bit of both. Mm-hmm. I started working in teams of data scientists looking at sustainability analytics for corporate social responsibility reports before I knew about procurement. Mm-hmm. And I actually found procurement by seeing the impact that procurement had on the metrics that mattered for this type of reporting.
Interesting. So from a sustainability perspective then, it's one of those things that I feel is really important for procurement professionals. It's an area where we can bring more value than what we're doing day in, day out in driving savings. But I still feel like it's one of those areas that we haven't really fully embraced yet. And I wonder if that's something that you saw when you were working within that environment as well. And perhaps what are some of the things that we could do differently so that we do start to embrace the idea of sustainability more in the things that we do?
You know, great question. And I think that it goes back to change management at the end of the day. So in a way, some of the questions that you see when you're doing sustainability analytics or sustainability consulting are actually the same questions you see when you're implementing new technology at scale. And it ultimately comes down to changing human behavior that, of course, is reverberating on the institutional momentum of decades and decades of people acting in a certain way. And you see that momentum. And institutions have memory, and you can see that memory gets played out in the way that workforces grow. I think in terms of procurement, the thing that I saw and the reason why, part of the reason I was called and driven to launch BidOps is that time and time again, you'd see sustainability professionals who would help and work with procurement teams to craft really good specs or really good contracting language. But ultimately, if you don't get the price down, it's not going to motivate people who are very focused on EBITDA, who are very focused on the financial performance of the business. And so what I realized is that instead of trying to, come in with the gospel of change, was to actually give people what they were already looking for. And then as people drive really outstanding savings targets, then a lot of other conversations, there's room for them there, and there's space. So I think in part it's a matter of sequencing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. In taking care of the blocking and the tackling and doing that successfully, that then gives you the leverage to do some other things that may not have the result of driving a cost saving, but do create value in other ways. Because we had a panel here this morning, for example, talking about the fact that larger organizations are still measured in savings, and they're always going to be measured in savings, and that's just a given, and that the fight isn't necessarily to go away from being measured in that way, but to have more informal other measures of value, and those are what you the kind of intangibles, but when you've got them, because that's when people are coming back for more and they want to work with you more than just a focus on the savings alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the suppliers notice that too. And you hear a lot about value-added relationships, and that's, I think, become a super theme over the past and future few years. Suppliers that distinguish based on total cost of ownership and value, ultimately need to make the case that there's a business case behind those differentiators. And so ultimately, the irony of things like CSR priorities is that in some cases, they'll be driven by changes in the market much more than changes in procurement.
Right. Yeah, and we're being reactive in some ways, or the opportunity comes in reacting to others wanting to make the change as opposed to us driving the change ourselves. So being prepared for that so that we're able to actually facilitate it when a business unit, for example, wants to become or invest more in sustainability around their products, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the theme that we've seen with vendor consolidation programs and aggregating more spend, the companies that are really serious about these programs will simply decide to buy fewer types of products and put more demand behind each of those. And I think, that's, we've seen a number of successful case studies of that, particularly around low-hanging fruit, like green cleaning programs or green fleet programs. But, at the end of the day, it all goes back to the negotiating table and what you're willing to give and get. And, 20 years ago, people, even longer ago, people realized that, what green means in most cases is that it costs more. And that's pretty much, in a lot of areas, that's all it means. And so I think there has to be kind of a reconciliation and a seriousness on both sides. What actually matters and how do we track against that? Whether it's savings, whether it's cost avoidance, whether it's something more analytical, just measuring success and making sure that success matches with what the leadership of the organization are broadcasting. Yeah,
and that they're willing to pay for things that may go above and beyond the typical scope. And I say that thinking about, for example, the news recently of Microsoft. What Microsoft are doing in terms of requiring suppliers to have certain maternity and paternity leave policies. And
fascinating.
To me, it's like I am really interested to see how that goes. I applaud them from my own personal belief system perspective, and being a European, seeing the differences between what you have in Europe and here. But it remains to be seen whether a private corporate enterprise can actually drive that social change, and if they're willing to pay the price. I mean, that's what it ultimately will come down to. Are they willing to pay the additional cost that those suppliers will incur for having those policies or not, when it's a competitive situation between one supplier who isn't, because they're a smaller supplier, perhaps they don't fall underneath the 50 employees and above, which I think the Microsoft policy is. But it's just an example of whether you're actually willing to pay for some of these policies that you believe are a good idea from a social perspective.
Well, and I think that, in my view, gets to the core question that procurement has right now, which is actually not how can we justify cost increases for more socially responsible behavior or socially responsible supply chains, but how can we aggregate our spend and effectively negotiate so that those supply chains and those suppliers are cheaper.
Right.
And what will be interesting to see is whether, Microsoft comes in and says, we want to do a capacity program. We want to extend you some credit. All of the things that a really good buying organization knows how to do, so that ultimately those suppliers become more market attractive to other companies. And that, I think, is that's really where a lot of the thinking behind sourcing optimization comes in, is that I think, in the old world, if you wanted something like a supply chain where all the suppliers offered paid leave, you had to pay more for it. And I think what people are realizing now is that it's not a choice. And procurement leaders are demanding both, and the more that happens, the more that those changes will be spread to the rest of society, I think.
You mentioned sourcing optimization there as a term. I just wonder if you could explain, for listeners who may not have heard that before, what it really is or what it means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I think in procurement, especially in the wave of technology that we've seen over the past 20 years, that we have to stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And I look at two companies, Trade Extensions and CombinedNet, as two companies that I've found very inspirational just in my own journey through procurement technology. And what you saw is that the way that people were making pivot tables back in the day, especially for multi-award contracts, was to say, okay, you have 10 sites or 20 sites, 20 plants, let's say, and you're awarding the same bid for the same unit of measure for the same input, raw materials, and which supplier should get which plant, given that many of them can bid on multiple plants and there will be overlap there, and where will that competition occur? And so you can treat that bid as a set of decisions that you move through linearly, or you can make the exponential step of treating it as a combinatorics problem and solving it. And so I saw those two companies that were using combinatorial bidding and really led into what's come to be called expressive commerce, where you expose demand to a large group of suppliers and allow them to express interest. And then you're able to get a sense of where driving competition produces really excellent outcomes.
So those suppliers would be expressing interest in perhaps only one element of a bid package, and you're able to see which supplier to which suppliers is which elements of the bid attractive, or are they coming in and looking at it as a whole and bidding on the entirety of a bid package?
So I think both. And I think in a lot of these cases, the more flexibility you give to a supplier in viewing the way that you've tranched out a contract, the more you reach outcomes that drive layers of productivity and efficiency beyond what you necessarily thought was possible when you were going out to bid. And so, we see some suppliers who are going to fill out a contract. They have two areas where they excel, but they want the whole thing, so they'll come in and fill out the contract. There are some others that specialize, really lean into their own competitive and comparative advantage in terms of their supply chains and where they've chosen to specialize. And I think what's interesting is that you had a conundrum for a long time where people said, how should we structure this? Should we bundle? Should we unbundle? Should we do it one at a time? And because there's process efficiency around getting a big group of line items and lots together, and you can run that cycle just so much faster. If you enable combinatorial sourcing optimization, you actually will get better results than if you ran them individually, just by aggregating that, because you get competition on the individual parts and the whole.
So you start to see who I think back to very early in my career in automotive business, I was responsible for light bulbs. So nothing particularly exciting, but it was an interesting marketplace where you had 3 suppliers, essentially, that supplied the whole world with automotive lamps. And certain ones of those, one of the suppliers would have capacity on one line, another one would have capacity on another line, another one may have just had a big capital investment in a particular bulb somewhere else. So they all had very different reasons for wanting to be competitive on one bulb versus another, and not on the others. And so what we would, before I really started to get involved in this, what we do is we just put it all out to bid. We'd say, okay, I'll give you a third, I'll give you a third, and I'll give you a third, and kind of go on your way. Only then did we start to go into the details of which specific lines had the open capacity that one supplier wanted over another, and you could start trading things off like that. So on the whole, you would actually get, we saved 50% over 2 or 3 years by doing that, and it was all manual. So now as I think about the opportunity to do that, and that was very small in that it was only 3 suppliers, but still, let's say 30 or 40 bulbs across the world, being able to do that through technology rather than through Excel spreadsheets, which is essentially what I was doing it through, I can't imagine how quicker the process would be, because that for us process would take 3 months and we do it every single year.
Absolutely. And I think that you see that in a lot of markets where you have, you've been doing business with the same 3 suppliers, you know them by name, you've met them, you have personal relationships with many of them. And what happens if there's some price that you pay added for an incumbent relationship, a relationship that's based on that trust, over time, the price gets a little bit higher and a little bit higher. And it's kind of like that old expression with the frog in the pot, where if you throw a frog into a really hot pot, then the frog jumps out and says, "Hell, no." But if you put it in there and slowly heat it up, then eventually the frog will boil. And a lot of supply chains have had their frog in a pot for quite some time, as far as cost goes, and particularly in industries that are can be quasi-monopolistic or have kind of internal cartels where all the quantities are known. Companies that just by running a bid, just by getting a competitive solicitation that brings in a couple new players, they might wind up with the same suppliers that they had before, but it will be at a dramatically lower cost. And in some cases, they'll bring in a new supplier just for one small part, and it's kind of like what you were saying. You're creating risk for the suppliers to increase their costs. You're imposing a potential liability on. You're
trying to build more of a competitive marketplace. I mean, that's what I found that we were doing, is we're actually trying to create competition in the marketplace, which then would increase our leverage. Buying something which was a leverage-based product, you can't do that for everything, of course. And that's actually kind of the follow-up, is when you think of, there's an awful lot of categories you can apply this to. I'm thinking logistics as well as a particular area where you have so many different lanes, permutations. It's so difficult to do that manually. It takes months and months and so much brain power if you're going to do it just through the human touch and Excel alone. But you run the risk as well of doing this in areas where the relationship is important. So are you actually just driving out the cost? You're also driving out the relationship. I wonder if you see kind of how you can balance those two things off on each other.
Well, I mean, first thing I'd say for logistics specifically is, if you want to look at a company that's done amazing work in that space, I'd point to Kielvar. They have really figured out the electronic reverse auction for logistics and commoditized it almost in such a way, made it so easy for people to put it together. So I just tip of the hat to them, a great team with great product. And I think that the more what you're seeing in the market is that, particularly we have a lot of customers for whom tariffs is an issue. And so being able to negotiate your Incoterms and seeing that as part of the bid, that's a tremendous leverage point, because you don't want to go ahead and cut off your nose to spite your face as far as cost savings go, and then see what the shipping bill looks like on the back end.
And you would often not see that so I know that I wouldn't see that again when I was in automotive, particularly because you're looking at it apples to apples, product to product, but you're not taking into effect, a shipping taxes, tariffs, all of those things, though somebody else on the back end is seeing that, you never actually get to see it, so you don't know the downstream impact of one decision versus another, and it completely changes what the right decision may be.
Well, and I think that's kind of where you get to, the question, oh, well, can't we do it in an Excel sheet? We're good at it. We've always done it this way. Why not? And the answer is, well, you could, but you probably only could do it for like your top 20 priorities. Yeah. And then at some point, people want to, leave the late day at the office and go spend time with their families or doing something else that doesn't involve typing into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Right. And I think that, the more that you see, okay, well, this can be done instantaneously now. It's 2018. All of these different factors can be rolled up into a single source of truth, and you can get an apples-to-apples comparison that will show you your ex-works pricing versus FOB. It will show you domestic supplier versus a supplier that may have a tariff, or there may be a risk that a tariff will come. And we see this really kind of across the market, where best-in-breed solutions are coming into the procurement department, and they're not in a real way forcing a lot of change, but they're allowing the people who are managing too many projects. And I know so many people in procurement who are just overworked.
Yeah, I think every single person, I think that's one thing that unites us all is there's never enough time in the day. And then that impacts, we do things that we know aren't necessarily the right things to do, but we just need to do things quickly.
Absolutely. And you want to talk about the real barrier in a lot of cases to implementing new technology or sustainability issues. It's time. It's that people are overworked. There are not enough hours in the day to get the work that's absolutely crucial and on fire done. And now you're coming in and asking to do a new initiative and do a whole new thing. And I think that's really where we see this theme, and we see it over and over again, the move from tactics and transaction to strategy. And lifting out of the workflow, the block and tackle, to see, hey, if I take a small amount of time to try something new, I might never have to look at this in an Excel worksheet again. And that's a great feeling.
So you mentioned about different best-of-breed companies now coming into the procurement space, and it's for sure I have a lot of conversations where I feel there's a lot more investment in procurement technology now than there's ever been before. It's an area that perhaps was ripe for additional investment, and now there's a lot of big companies interested in our space. I wonder, what kind of technologies do you see that are actually, now this is a bit of a cliche word, but game-changing, because I think of technology and procurement so far, and while it's gotten better and it's gotten more user-friendly, it's still always been pretty much to make existing processes more efficient. It's not been to actually change the game of what we do.
Sure.
So I wonder if there's some things that you're keeping an eye on that are actually, could be transformative for the value prop of a procurement professional over and above, it's going to save me a little bit more time so I can put out a few more fires.
So, and I love the way that you framed that too, because I think that a lot of solutions out there have taken a manual process and put it on the internet or put it in the cloud or,
and done a great job doing it. But it's an efficiency play.
Exactly. And I think, the next wave of procurement technology is going to take some insights which, people who are expert consultants who work at, A.T. Kearney or McKinsey or Accenture, or Deloitte or any of the others would use manually, or they'd bring their army of analysts and have them cut up the spend and find savings. But that actually can be done, and the process of categorizing and defining opportunities can already be automated. And I think what's interesting, look at a company like Supplari or a company like Valueadded. Those are two companies that have picked areas within the procurement stack and like spend analysis. Spend analysis is something where there are a lot of platforms that will help you do the spend analysis, but you still have to do it. And the next wave of procurement technology I see is really allowing you to do it a couple times, but what you're really doing is teaching the machine how to do most of the work, and then for you to be able to confirm the final steps.
Yeah, and you're looking at the 2 or 3% every month that don't conform to the learning that the machine has already done because it's familiar with your spend, familiar with spends that are like yours in similar industries to you.
Exactly.
So it makes it a lot less of a lot less human element that goes into it, and then ultimately more accurate data.
And so in the case, for example, of supplier, you see programmatic identification of savings and compliance opportunities. And you see that flagging invoices, flagging purchase orders. Well, I mean, in terms of the way that consulting and procurement has worked over the past, many decades, it's always been, well, there's so much opportunity to find a few invoices that just have an extra zero or so in them. That's actually has been a really good business to be in. And I think what you're going to see is that those consultancies will have to figure out how their business models will change in light of the fact that you can buy today a continuous audit that will go through your invoices and purchase orders.
It's just always running.
And it's always running. So you don't need, and you can think about the money that would have gone to an army of people who are quite highly compensated.
Because they find errors.
Yes, exactly.
What's interesting to me around that too is the idea of that then builds a culture of compliance. So where suppliers may have felt they could get away with things in the past or not be, that they're not standing up to the accuracy of their invoices all the time, especially when you're in high volume buys, that would get through the cracks. Well, now if there's a culture of compliance because there's going to be somebody always watching, then they've got to be more careful. And so you might not actually find the errors so much because there's actually the accuracy is higher in the first place. It increases kind of the quality.
I was thinking this morning about why procurement in its digital transformation, why people often describe it as falling behind. And I was shaving in the mirror, and there's like one little spot on my face that I always miss. And I now remembered it enough times that I go back and get it. But why do I miss that spot? It's simply because it's hard to reach. And it's not visible. So if I look at my face straight on, I don't see the
you got to be a certain angle,
tiny little spot on the side of my cheek. And I think that big change in procurement is hard to reach, or it has been hard to reach, and that's why people haven't done it. And that's why the benefit that I think what you're going to see is that more and more these consultants are actually going to become partners for implementing solutions that create what you just described, this culture of compliance, this culture of accountability. And then actually the biggest gains are from that culture, rather than from a piece of technology or from a momentary savings event. Right.
It is interesting that really the technology, there was at the beginning of the day today, some discussion around technology is kind of the vehicle for some of the transformation, but the transformation isn't technology itself.
Correct, yeah.
And how, so that we shouldn't be looking at technology as being the panacea for all of our problems, but embracing it to change the way that we do business, change the way that we work, and then leverage these new technologies, as opposed to, it's going to sit and do something and it's going to take everything away from you. It's just how can we change the way that we interact with it to create different outcomes?
Absolutely. I think that, one thing that we look at BidOps a lot is this idea, okay, so you have a company like, Leva Data in market intelligence for bills of materials. You have a company that's doing spend analytics. Well, those seem like things, reasonably speaking, that you're checking a bunch of spreadsheets, so you can have a computer check a bunch of spreadsheets. And people always ask us, well, you're doing negotiations. You're doing automated negotiations. That seems like something that's so human and so built into relationships. We have customers that before they began using BidOps did all of their negotiations in person.
Right.
Yeah,
so, and that's... It was interesting to me. I really want to dive a little bit into the concept of automating negotiations, because when you talk and when we think, you write down a piece of paper, what are all the things that I think that technology has the potential to take away from us or help us be more effective in, and what's all the things that still require the human touch and that are free from the impact of technology. And one of those things you would just naturally think is negotiations, because it's historically been such a person-to-person endeavor. So it's interesting to me in two ways. One is that all the things that we assume can't be touched by technology probably can. But what does an automated negotiation look like?
Well, so I think the important thing is that touched by technology is different than replaced by technology. Yeah. And so a negotiator, when they're conducting either between just one vendor and themselves or a bunch of different vendors, there are a number of tasks. And in software development, we have this idea, jobs to be done. And jobs to be done is a framework for all of the different steps that you go through and the way that you build efficiencies into that. And so really good product managers and product designers and product thinkers they process map all of the steps that a person goes through when they're completing a task. They figure out which ones can be done in an efficient or instantaneous way by a machine. And then they go, hey, try this out. And then they slowly make it better over time. And so that's really been our journey. We're an agile shop. We use agile software development. So we're constantly making tiny tweaks and little improvements. The tariff feature is a relatively new feature.
It's very relevant
relevant right now. But it was something where we thought, saw it could add a lot of value, and so popped it in.
So you take a negotiation and then you break that negotiation down into a process and then say, okay, which are the steps that technology can handle, and then how can we present the information from technology handling that part of the negotiation in a way that gives the buyer what they want to be more effective? Is that essentially how you're approaching it?
So absolutely, except the thing that I think is important is that our software will actually execute the negotiation. So you can specify the parameters, you can define what success looks like. That can be on a savings basis as well as a performance, quality, many different factors. And then BidOps will request pricing and answers to RFI-style pre-qualification questions from a group of vendors or an individual vendor, and will continue communicating with that vendor until a awarded outcome has been reached.
So if you think about that from a more of a commoditized product. So a commoditized product, you don't necessarily know, how low you can get the price. Let's assume that the only thing that's important is price. And so you use a typical reverse auction, and that's a way for you to get an idea of where the floor is in a market. As you're going through this process, you're doing an automated negotiation. I feel it'd be difficult to give up the control of saying, yes, that's enough. When they may have reached that floor, but actually there's more to give. I wonder how you kind of encourage people either that there's a solution to that, or the change management that says that allows them to have trust in the platform to get the optimal result.
So that's a really terrific point to hit on, because I think what we see actually is that the process of designing a negotiation is very different than the process of simply hammering a supplier to get a lower price. So what we've found is that transparency in the process will not only lead to a better outcome for the procuring entity, it actually leads to a better outcome for the vendors. So we've had instances where we've seen a bid where vendors really needed to lock in their supply chain capacity, and they needed to have some predictability and stability. And so the buyer, by delaying, using an older process that involved Excel spreadsheets and email, was actually adding substantial costs, not because the supplier wanted to upcharge them, but because there literally was a cost to waiting.
Yes, cost of doing business.
Cost of doing business, and so you're building the risk of doing business into that price of the product. So time to market and time to get a negotiation started is huge. To start a negotiation on BidOps takes a matter of minutes and seconds, not hours and days. And in terms of designing that negotiation, you let the suppliers know how many rounds of negotiation will be taking place.
Yeah.
So it's not an ad infinitum hammering process. You let them know, here are your opportunities. And that also has the effect of meaning that instead of what you see in reverse auctions, which is a minimum decrement bidding strategy. So if you created a robot to be a vendor, your optimal bidding strategy in any reverse auction would be to bid the minimum decrement down and to essentially run out the clock. Yeah. And that's not really that great because it can take a long time. A, you can have some bid sniping issues. B, and C is that you're ultimately not introducing predictability for the supplier. So it's a one-sided process. Yeah. What you see in a really good negotiation, and I want to mention this because I think this goes back into, you asked the question, what is an automated negotiation? Well, we sat down with a group of experts across the industry and said, okay, for best practice negotiators, what does a good negotiation look like? And we came up from doing hundreds of interviews with 6 attributes that all really good negotiations have. 1, they have a high dollar value of winning the business. So you've aggregated some spend beforehand. You've actually made it attractive as a proposition to be a business partner. 2, you have enabled competition by tracking optimal participation. So I mentioned earlier getting a new vendor to be involved in a negotiation can actually really change the outcome. If you're whatever the initiative is, a change management initiative, a sustainability initiative, get a little competition in there. Get a couple new vendors.
Now, I just want to ask on that. So when you're bringing in new suppliers or potential suppliers into a bid scenario, how much validation is there beforehand, or how much validation do you recommend beforehand that they're actually fit for purpose, that you would be awarding them the business, if that was the outcome of the bid?
So it's possible to do it both ways. So it's kind of how the user is using it at that point, and how what the standard operating procedure at the customer is. Yeah. But in terms of what I would recommend,
it's always somebody you're going to give the business, or that you were willing to give the business to.
Yes. Yeah. So don't run a supplier around a merry-go-round if you're not going to let them actually get on the ride. And furthermore, I think it's just imagine that, have a beginner's mind and imagine new possibilities. Yeah. So, if you have the opportunity to onboard a supplier really fast, figure out what information you actually need to collect them and put pressure to make a decision by having a clear timeline in your project. And so the business customer or risk management or legal knows that there's going to be a substantial cost to the business from them not enabling competition that will decrease the price of your bottom line revenue.
Yeah.
I mean, all your inputs.
So. And I've always found that, the participants in the market, they know the market better than you do.
Oh, yeah.
And so they'll spot a supplier who isn't fit for purpose a mile off.
Oh, sure.
In the early days of reverse auctions, I would see for the commodities that I bought at the time, we were using a technology provider. It was a new technology provider in the market. They were coming with suppliers to certain bid situations, and they were just suppliers you would never, ever actually consider awarding the business to. And as a result, we actually had scenarios where, it was kind of a monopoly situation, and all of a sudden this new player arrives from nowhere in the middle of the Dominican Republic, which was like a real example that I had for one of the commodities that I took responsibility for once. And, you look back at what happened in the bid, how come we're paying more money? Well, the supplier knew that they had all the leverage because you're bringing in people who couldn't supply. So they know that basically they're the only person in town. So I always encourage do a lot of work beforehand. Even if you don't end up using that supplier, you're creating more of a competitive marketplace because you have the risk to the other participants is greater because they know that you can award the business somewhere else.
Well, and I think that as you see these vendor consolidation initiatives and spend aggregation initiatives, you are innately creating more leverage for the supplier as time goes on. So there's a cycle here. Right. Yeah. We save 20% by aggregating all of our spend to one supplier. Well, that supplier,
that 20% might not last very long.
They're aware that they need you, but you kind of need them. So I got 4 more attributes of a best negotiation. So 3 is enable a greater number of responses from each individual vendor over the course of the negotiation. So more offers generally is better, although they have to be meaningfully different, and I think that's important.
Yeah,
you'll see a reverse auction where each decrement is one, but they're not meaningfully
It's the minimum,
different.
as you said before, it's the minimum increment that they can make just to stay in the game, to see how many people, by taking that process, will fall by the wayside, so they can figure out, actually, this is my competition, and it's only between 2 of us at the end of the day.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to part of good negotiation design, and this is something I saw as a consultant, as a project manager. Have a clear timeline, and even a clear timeline within the negotiation. We have negotiations that run for hours. We have negotiations that run for days. We had a negotiation the other day that ran start to finish 8 minutes. And you have to let that was for one of our Fortune 100 customers, and they were buying a raw material that required the supplier to purchase a hedge on the open market. And so it's such a fast market that the suppliers, the vendors, had to have their brokers on the phone.
They could only commit to a price in time based on where the market was in that hour, because
even
of what
though
hedge
it was
was.
A forward buy because of the hedging. And so the cycle time is very important. Defining that, being transparent about it, and making sure that if you're on a timeline, that you let people know. Communicating urgency in an unambiguous and clear way does such wonders for this bidding process. And then the last 2 are things that we all kind of intuitively know, but we don't necessarily. I don't know very many organizations that measure this across their bids. So number 5 is the number and percentage of improvement events. So an improvement event is any time a bid gets better, or the award tabulation changes. We have an internal metric for that called the optimum award tabulation improvement, OATI, and it's the number of times that a deal gets better. So if you have a lot of times that your deal got better, it's not an exact proxy of savings, because that metric can be weird depending on what category you're in, but it will tell you the number of times that you got a better deal.
And that could be, and the opposite of that could be, there's so many permutations in these bids that different scenarios can actually drive a less positive result than the last one, because different elements have changed. So you're tracking how many collectively end up being a positive, like a net positive.
So just as an example, if you get 2 bids and one's better than the other, you have an OATI of 1. Let's say that another supplier bids 7 more times, but none of those bids beats the original best bid. Your OATI is still 1. So you might have gotten more offers, or you might have gotten a better kind of negotiation cadence going, but you didn't get...
The outcome hasn't changed.
The outcome hasn't changed. So really actually being outcomes focused and measuring the number of times that an outcome changes. There's actually a proxy for this in reverse auctions: lead changes. So we took the idea of a lead change but turned it into a way to measure sourcing optimization. And then the last one is the final difference between apples to apples comparison of every important KPI applied to every vendor's final bid. And if you do a negotiation really well, you'll get 2 or 3 candidates that are very similar. And so your ironic metric is that it's ironic that the metric is that you really want a couple candidates who are pretty much just as good as the other. And then you can tell the business customer, hey, I want to bring you in and really invite you to make the decision.
And it's also interesting that if you have one that's far, far better than everybody else, there's always the question of how are they doing it. Most of the time, if somebody's doing an apples to apples quote on a particular piece of business, it's not possible for them to be 20% better than everybody else in the market. So if you're actually seeing those discrepancies, you're wondering how are they actually getting there, and what does that mean for them once the business has been awarded?
Oh, absolutely. If you see someone that's like way off from the other ones, I mean, that's I think always a red flag, and people generally know to. And that's the thing is, right, even with, we have this, AI-driven platform that can do all of these wonderful things, but our customers will still pick up the phone to that vendor who gave the 20% off and say, hey, walk me through this.
Yeah, is this real?
Is this real? Where's this coming from?
Yeah.
And so you're always going to have the procurement manager, the analyst, the bid manager in that scenario, who's still going to be augmenting the technology. They're just not spending their time making pivot tables. They're spending their time watching their dashboard, tracking progress, and when they need to pick up the phone, to pick up the phone.
Now, if we go, and I know it's about time that I got to wrap up, and also I want to make sure that we wrap up before we get kicked out of the room
for sure.
that we're in here at ProcureCon. So looking into the future, already this feels futuristic, even though it's happening right now in terms of what our baseline expectation or our understanding of negotiations are. But it doesn't seem like it's a great leap of faith to suggest that, okay, we're at a point where we're semi-automating negotiations. We're doing it on one side of the coin, and you still have a supplier on the other side who is largely manually entering the data into this to allow this process to take part. At what point do we get two computers negotiating with each other?
Well, so one point I would make is that our AI makes a strong recommendation to the supplier what they should bid.
Okay.
And so it is, in a sense, taking both sides of the table. And we see that forecast of the outcome of a negotiation accepted by the supplier community far more often than it's modified. And so that's really how we know that our algorithms and our AI is doing its job, is when the supplier looks at it and says, this is a good quote.
Yeah.
I want to know what quote is competitive. Yeah. Let me bid it. In terms of two computers negotiating, I think, never say never. And I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, is a computer going to be on Jeopardy?
Right.
I probably would have said no. When I was in high school and college, I was on the debate team. And recently, IBM had a computer called Project Debater, which is now able to conduct oral arguments. To me, those types of advancements are astonishing and even slightly scary. And I work in artificial intelligence, and I, have there's kind of a chill factor to some extent. In terms of what, is the process going to be fully automated end to end, back and forth? The place I would urge your listeners to look, and just as a thought experiment, is to look at what has happened with AdWords and the bidding for words in online advertising. So that was something that was procured by phone to place a bid to own a particular word to show a banner ad to a user on a web page. It then went into very much a electronic reverse auction phase. And today, many of those auctions that run in the space of a millisecond as a web page is loading on your screen to determine which banner ads will show,
right?
Those are automated.
Yeah.
And so if I was to, pose perhaps a model for how enterprise procurement might evolve, I would suggest looking at digital advertising and the way that bidding processes and bidding markets in that area have moved forward.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there in the next 5, even maybe 10 years in enterprise procurement. Yeah. The human element, and honestly, the resurgent importance to the business, to EBITDA, to the interest now of boards and investors in looking at a company's procurement and seeing how those decisions get made. I think that is the theme that you're seeing now. And procurement in a lot of procurement shops is a longer way to go before we're talking about any of that.
But I could see kind of in tail spend, maybe that there's use cases once the technology is able to run some of your tail spend through scenarios like that, assuming that at that point we have tail spend and it's not all bought through a catalog, for example,
Sure.
that's gone through one single service provider. So who knows what that's going to look like in the next 5 or 10 years. But the idea of AdWords is fascinating because every single time you type something into a search bar in your search engine, you're creating a marketplace.
Yep.
Essentially, and there's parameters.
An instantaneous, machine-driven marketplace where different customers that want to get something in front of your eyes are bidding against each other to do it. And it happens so fast, we don't see it, we don't notice it. But as a buyer of those ads, you've told the search engine, these are the parameters within which I'm willing to spend money. Exactly.
And so it takes all those permutations of the 10,000 other people who want to be ranking or who want to have their ads rendered for that search term. It's taking all that into effect in that millisecond to decide this is the one that I'm going to place at this price. It's not even a set price. It's, the price changes second by second.
Well, and I think just to kind of bring it back to where we started, if you have a culture where you have parameters and you measure success and you know what it looks like to win, then you have all of the component parts to, as that technology becomes available, to get a huge amount of value by plugging in something that you're already culturally attuned to.
Yeah.
If you don't know what success looks like and you're trying to figure out your parameters and you don't measure a lot of metrics across your interactions with vendors or the way that your business customers are spending, all of that other stuff becomes a lot harder.
Right.
So I think it ultimately, procurement technology will follow business needs. It will follow, the vision that is set by, the C-suite and executive teams, and it will plug into a culture that's already made a decision to value success and to value winning, and that ultimately that culture will drive so much more of the change that you'll see over the next 10 and 20 years.
Well, on that note, I do need to wrap up. So what I want to do is ask one last question.
For sure.
We're very fortunate and we have a very engaged audience of listeners at Art of Procurement. They often reach out to guests after the show. If anybody would like to reach out to you and connect directly, what would be the best way for them to find you?
So you can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. is a great way. I'm very active in LinkedIn procurement communities on LinkedIn, and then hello@bidops.com or Edmund EDMUND at bid-ops.com.
Right. And for anybody who's driving, you don't need to worry about writing that down right now. I'm going to include that in the show notes. So all the contact details for Edmund will be at artofprocurement.com/bidops. That's artofprocurement.com/bidops. So thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Philip. It's an honor to be a guest on your show.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.